Professor Jaap Scheffer is someone who has seen NATO from all sides and is extraordinarily qualified to share his views on this very current subject. He's flown here today from the Netherlands to speak to us, and we're extremely grateful. Ik heet u van harte welkom. Please join me in welcoming to the Chicago Council, Professor Jaap Scheffer.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hartog Levin. Thank you very much, Niam King. Great pleasure to be here. Great to have the privilege to speak in a series where one of the most respected Secretaries of State of the United States of America, Madeleine Albright, will speak. And two of my dear American friends have already spoken. Ivo Daalder, whose Dutch is as good as mine, and as Ambassador Hartog. And Nick Burns, Professor Burns, now from Harvard, Under-Secretary Burns, former Under-Secretary Burns, who was, I can tell you, one of my great sponsors when the decision had to be made, is Jaap Scheffer going to become Secretary General of NATO. So it's really a privilege to be here and to speak to you. And what I would like to do tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is two things. The Ambassador already referred to them. Tell you something about how I see Europe, how I see the European continent, and more specifically the European Union developing. And secondly, of course, it was indicated what, in my view, would be the important agenda items for the upcoming NATO summit here in Chicago at the end of May. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell you nothing new when I say that Europe is going through and is facing a severe financial economic crisis, is going through fundamental financial economic reforms, and is facing a rather unprecedented age of austerity. Savage public spending cuts in a Europe which has become, partly as a consequence of the crisis, but it happened already before, a Europe which has become more inward-looking, in my opinion, than it was before. A Europe where public opinion and more in general society is impatient. There's a lot of impatience in public opinion in Europe. They want a quick fix from their political leaders. And as you know as well as I do, in many European nations, populism and populist parties are on the rise. And populism, in my opinion, is another expression of impatience. Because populists say, we know that quick fix. You're much too slow, government. We know the quick fix. We know what we should do. And they gain the support of, I'm afraid to say, rather many people by focusing on two main issues and two main subjects. The first one is migration, integration of minorities. Not a new problem. Not a problem which in all major European cities or nations is completely solved. I don't deny that there are problems, of course, with migration. But the populist parties add a spoonful of xenophobia. Not only, by the way, vis-à-vis non-Western migrants living in Europe or coming to Europe, but recently in the Netherlands also vis-à-vis our fellow Polish Europeans who come to the Netherlands to work in the greenhouses. You know, the Dutch are famous for their greenhouses, flower exports, vegetable exports. Without those Polish laborers, that sector of society would hardly survive. But they have migration, integration of minorities, and where that is not anymore sufficient, they have focused on Europe. Brussels and Europe is the source of all evil. Everything bad comes from Brussels, and everything good should come from them. And they say to me, Jaap Scheffer, to you, my distinguished audience, you can talk about globalization, and we do talk about globalization, and NATO talks about globalization, but we rather talk about glocalization with a C. I didn't coin the word, by the way. Glocalization. What does glocalization mean? It means my own village, my own city, my own region, my own province, my own nation is enough. Why the heck should I bother about other European nations? Why should I bother about Afghanistan? Why are we sending tens of thousands of soldiers to Afghanistan? Those are two main themes used by them, not specifically Dutch, as you know, because you see populism on the rise in nations like Sweden, in Finland, in France, upcoming presidential elections in France, in Belgium, and in other nations as well. And the problem now is that you and I can fairly easily bring up the list of threats and challenges faced by us and by our societies in the 21st century. You all know this list. Terrorism with its many faces. Climate change, water shortage, food shortage, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, cybercrime and cyber attacks. You name them. Not one of these threats and challenges, not one of them, will ever find a solution within national boundaries. Not in small or medium-sized nations in Europe, and even not in a superpower like the United States of America. But the problem is, a cosmopolitan elite, of which I'm a member, I mean, I'm talking to myself here as well, a cosmopolitan elite, and the political elite more in general, has lost touch with the globalizers. In many societies, it is also a gap between the higher educated and the lower educated. So let's say the solution to the question I'm raising is extremely complicated. But I'm trying to, as I promised, to give you my analysis or what is happening on the European continent. And I do think you cannot forget about these elements then. The second thing, ladies and gentlemen, we have to realize, Europe is a secular continent. There is no continent in this world as secular or secularized as the European continent. Of course, Europe's roots, Judaism, Christianity, humanism, Enlightenment, are and stay essential roots for Europe. But in a globalizing, smaller, flatter, Friedman would say, world, where Europe is not calling the shots anymore, because the values and norms Europe has always been preaching, and the United States of America as well for that matter, are not as dominant as they have been over centuries. Think about the colonial days. So Europe is also confronted, not being a superpower, with this smaller world, and with nations and even continents where religion does play a role in society, and not only in the private domain as in Europe, but in the public domain as well. And I remember that I had very interesting and intense discussions with President Karzai of Afghanistan when I visited Afghanistan as NATO Secretary General about a notion like the universality of human rights. We have a universal declaration of human rights. And I said, Mr. President, we should discuss it. And he said, Mr. Secretary General, I don't know if your interpretation of universality is exactly the same as mine. Now, in previous times, as a European, you could say, but this is it, sorry, but end of discussion. That is not the case anymore, I'm afraid. So Europeans are not only confronted with this financial economic crisis and with populism, I think it is also a matter of identity. Where does Europe stand in the first decades of the 21st century? And Europe and the European nations have some difficulties in defining their own role. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you might conclude, having listened to my first 10 minutes, me describing the state of Europe, that Europe is nearing the status of an open-air museum with much of a glorious past, but not much of a future. How wrong, ladies and gentlemen, that conclusion would be. Because I can tell you, the European Union will survive. The euro and the monetary union will survive. This monetary union, this euro project, is unprecedented. And I do think that so much political capital has been invested in this monetary union, with all its flaws, I admit, by European political leaders, that no major European political leader can afford the euro project to fail. Mark my words, I'm not saying that would I be here in a year or 1.5 years from now, that all 17 nations participating in the euro are still participating in the euro then. So I'm not giving you a guarantee that all can stay in. I think I can promise you that given the investment in political capital, the euro will survive. And the European Union's most important nation in this regard, Germany, and its leader, Chancellor Angela Merkel, for whom I have the greatest respect, let me add that, has steered the European Union, supported by France, sometimes wholeheartedly, sometimes a bit reluctantly, has steered the European Union to a much closer form of financial, economic, monetary integration than you and I would have considered possible only 1.5 years ago. There has been a lot of integration by the back door, to say it a bit colloquially. That is, by the way, what the populists, of course, don't like, integration by the back door. In general, I don't like it either, but there were not many alternatives. The proof of this pudding is the fiscal compact, which was signed by a great number of European nations not that long ago. In other words, on the financial, monetary, economic front, we have seen forces of integration which under normal circumstances would have taken a decade to achieve. I regret, by the way, discussing Europe in this respect, that another major and great European nation, the United Kingdom, decided to veto this fiscal compact. Of course, they are not participating in the euro, but Prime Minister Cameron decided not to accept the fiscal compact. And why do I regret this? Because I'm afraid that the United Kingdom might lose some clout in other domains as well by staying at such a big distance from Europe's financial and monetary integration. The second reason why the open-air museum theory would be very wrong, and a wrong conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, would be, and that's certainly relevant for you, because it would be against vital interests of the United States of America. Do not forget, Europe is the United States' largest trading partner, by far the biggest investor in the United States of America. And last but not least, as Ambassador Burns rightly concluded here a few weeks ago, the European allies are the US's largest collection of allies in the world, bound together primarily in the North Atlantic Alliance called NATO. So there's a huge interest involved. And if you want to look at it from a more geopolitical perspective, look at Europe's proximity to Russia. Look at Europe's geographical proximity to the Middle East, to the Arab world, in turmoil. I hesitate to talk about an Arab Spring. It's certainly an awakening. In Syria, it's definitely not a spring. In Egypt, I do not know if it will be spring. I don't know about other nations either. But that there's turmoil and that there's revolution, yes, we do know indeed. Europe is close. And Europe should matter for them, and they should matter for Europe. In other words, also in the geopolitical domain, it is a great US interest. And NATO, of course, is the bedrock of that relationship in the security domain between Europe and the United States of America. So let me, after having paid some attention to Europe, and you will not be surprised, pay some attention to NATO in the run-up to the Chicago summit, and give you my impression of not only of what the agenda is, but what the agenda should be. And I should hesitate here a bit, because the position of armchair general is not a position I like. There are too many people and politicians in this world, as soon as they've stepped down, they know exactly how their successor should do it. So abide with me if you might conclude after my lecture that I have not lived up to this principle. Let me give you a few main elements, in my opinion, after almost 6 years having been NATO Secretary General, essential for NATO. First of all, NATO must realize, and allies must realize, that NATO is a political military alliance. NATO is not just a military alliance, because a military alliance without a political foundation will not survive. It is simply not enough. So, NATO should become more political, because that is the only way in which NATO can make the difference. Now, if you look at the agenda of the North Atlantic Council in Brussels, be it at ambassadorial level or at ministerial level, or, like we'll see in Chicago, at heads of state and government level, that agenda of the North Atlantic Council usually focuses, for understandable reasons, on NATO's operations, be it in Afghanistan, be it the anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, be it Kosovo, you name them, many of them. When I was a young Secretary of Embassy, and Ambassador Hartog-Levin referred to that, and I did my first duties at NATO in the 70s of the last century, during the Cold War, the North Atlantic Council every week had an agenda item called Statements on Political Subjects. And then all the topics in world politics were discussed. And I do think that NATO ministers and ambassadors should do that again. In other words, should become more political to see that NATO is that political/military alliance we all like to see it to be. If people might find this a bridge too far, I could live with a suggestion, I think made here by Frank Kramer on the conference held here in Chicago not that long ago, to have a consultative group which could then take the role of intensifying this political discussion I would like to see taking place in NATO. The European Union does it. European Union ministers, usually the same guys apart from a few, they talk politics. NATO ministers and NATO ambassadors should do that again, in my opinion. Why am I stressing this point, ladies and gentlemen? I do this because I want to avoid that NATO becomes a more voluntary alliance. I use the words now of your countryman Hans Binnendijk of the National Defense University. NATO should not become a more voluntary alliance where nations choose what they want to do and what they do not want to do. The Libya operation is a case in point. Libya was for NATO a huge military success. Ivo Daalder, possibly in this same room, has said many good words about that. Libya militarily was a success. But I wonder if the process within NATO to come to a political consensus before the military operation started in Libya was sufficiently addressed by nations. I'm left with the impression that we saw a sort of reversed procedure in NATO. Instead of reaching a political consensus after which nations decide to participate or not to participate in the military operation, opt out is the word we use in the NATO jargon, we saw nations opting in on the basis of their national preferences before the political consensus was fully reached. And the result of this was that only 8 of the 28 NATO allies fully participated in the Libya operation. So I say again, militarily it was a success. By the way, to qualify my own statement, without essential assistance of the United States, it would not have been possible to do what NATO did. It would not have been possible if and when the European allies would have been forced to go it all by themselves. But let's in other words, prevent NATO become too much of a voluntary alliance. It should be an alliance of 28 sovereign nations participating in NATO. And again, if this is stretching a bit too far, have a consultative group. A more political NATO, ladies and gentlemen, also means, in my opinion, that political consultations with key NATO partners should be intensified. Afghanistan has shown that nations like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, but also Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, Georgia, and many others are of key importance to the alliance. Libya showed that the United Arab Emirates and Qatar can push beyond their weight. Keep these partners politically as close to our chest as possible, is my advice. Stimulate political consultation with them across the board. I know there's discussion going on as I speak in the NATO domain on who will get invitations for the NATO summit in Chicago. I hope that as many partners as possible, relevant partners of course, will find an invitation on their doorstep. My argument is the notion that I do not see how NATO, after having been present more than a decade in Afghanistan, and after many other operations on many continents, could again become just a regional organization. I don't see that happening. There's a fierce debate. What is NATO? Is NATO a global policeman, a global cop? Le gendarme du monde, as the French so nicely say. In French it always sounds a bit better. Or is NATO a regional organization? I think those partners have proven in Afghanistan that they are of vital importance to NATO, and I would, as I said, like them as close as possible. Not forgetting and never forgetting, ladies and gentlemen, that Article 5 is the bedrock of the NATO treaty, and that stability in the NATO area is and will remain of key importance for all 28 NATO nations. Because you cannot go to the Baltic region, dear friends, and only saying NATO should become this global cop. Because they'll say, we have a history, and we like to have you, NATO allies, air policing our skies. We face no threat. NATO is not facing any threat. But just in case, you here in Tallinn and in Vilnius and in Riga, just in case, we want to be sure, we want to be certain that NATO is there. My third point, and a very difficult one, ladies and gentlemen, how to bring NATO's ambitions in line with budgets which for quite some time to come will not substantially grow, and I'm putting it very mildly here. What does it mean, austerity, diminishing budget? It means, as my successor, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Secretary General of NATO, has said, that we have to be smart, anyway much smarter than we have been up till now. It is stunning to see the lack of coordination between the European allies who are all trimming their defense budgets. And I think that such a situation is not acceptable. When the Dutch Minister of Defense, supported by Parliament, decides to do away with the Dutch tank divisions, his armor, his heavy armor, he can do that, but I hope not all European defense ministers are going to do away with their tanks. Because then you see European armed forces without armor. And that is not exactly the object of the exercise. There's no coordination, and I very much regret that. When the European nations who might decide to change their F-16 fighter aircrafts for the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, and many nations are thinking about this, I would say, please do it together. Your maintenance, your basing, buying those F-35 fighter aircraft. Do it together and economize as much as you can. Bring the European Union and NATO as close together as they can in this regard. Smart defense, Anders Fogh Rasmussen again, should of course, as he and I will agree, amount to more than a shopping list of hardware. We'll all agree about this. And in this regard, we should have the courage to go the extra mile in NATO, and I know what I'm going to say now is awfully complicated and awfully difficult, to have a critical look at how we finance our alliance. Our alliance is financed on the principle the costs lie where they fall. Each nation pays for its own participation in operations, for its own defense equipment, for its own hardware. So if you have a modern Apache attack helicopter, NATO will ring your doorbell and say, please, could you bring that Apache attack helicopter to Afghanistan? Yes, sir, the nation says to the Secretary General. You pay. You've paid for the helicopter to buy it. You pay for sending it to Afghanistan. You pay for the wear and tear. You pay for the reinvestment. And the ally not having Apache attack helicopters will not be asked by NATO, sits back and is very comfortable. That is, I think, in the longer run, unsustainable. But I know there will be much water flowing through the Rhine, as we say in Dutch, before this might come to a solution. But I'll go one step further. I do not think, personally, that the way we finance our alliance will survive in the long run. Also because of this huge disbalance and imbalance between the United States of America and its European allies, which has gone from 50-50 to 75-25 as far as military expenditure is concerned. And that is not sustainable. My advice would be to NATO, I said it already and I'll say it briefly again, bring NATO and the European Union as close together as possible. The relationship, once qualified by me as a frozen conflict, and not everybody in Europe liked that, I must admit, but it is a frozen conflict. NATO and European Union ambassadors cannot talk to each other. The two organizations compete with each other from time to time, and that is also having more than 20 allies who are at the same time members of NATO and members of the European Union. That is an unsustainable situation. So my plea, ladies and gentlemen, is bring the European Union and NATO as close together as possible. Your administrations, plural, President George W. Bush and also very much President Obama, have recognized the European Union as a very important European entity. So long past are the times when also from the capital of your beautiful nation, Washington, one looked with a special eye and from time to time a not very confident eye to the European Union. The European Union is there to stay, NATO is there to stay. Let the two work as closely together as possible. The relationship between myself and Javier Solana as High Representative of the European Union were excellent. The relationship between Cathy Ashton, the High Representative of the European Union, and my successor Anders Fogh Rasmussen are excellent, but politically there is a lot to do. Almost finally, let us also to be smart on what is happening and going to happen in Afghanistan. Yesterday we saw again, or the day before, horrible attacks in Kabul by the Taliban, Haqqani network / we don't exactly know, but there should not be too much uncertainty who did this. Let's be smart. We've been there now for more than a decade. And speaking now as a keen observer of newspapers, radio and television, it is for me a bit unclear in the run-up to the Chicago summit if NATO operations are going to end in 2013 or 2014. It is not entirely clear to me when combat operations are going to end. It's not entirely clear to me what will happen in Afghanistan after 2014. Will there be a residual combat capacity in Afghanistan? Special forces? I think yes. Should that be exclusively a task performed by the United States of America? I think no. But this will be a debate at the Chicago summit, I can guarantee. And it's an important one because you cannot just in 2014 leave Afghanistan and close the door behind you. Too much, I say again, political and human capital has been invested in that operation. And it has not been easy. And it is certainly not an unqualified success. But I've been there almost 20 times in the time I was Secretary General of NATO, and I can tell you a lot has been achieved. Let's not just close the door behind us. And let NATO try to keep the solidarity it has shown, because all NATO members participated in Afghanistan, not to abandon that nation after 2014. Help the United States of America finance the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police. See that there is a residual fighting capability. And pay attention. My plea to the heads of state and government coming to Chicago in a few weeks would be, see that you come to some form of a regional arrangement. History in Afghanistan proves that it has always been used, that beautiful nation, as a pawn to serve the interest of other bigger neighbors and other nations. Now, the much regretted Dick Holbrooke, who passed away last year, and I can say was a great friend of mine, went out of his way with Pakistan and other nations to see if some form of a political arrangement would not be possible after 2014. Mark Grossman, also an outstanding US diplomat, is now trying to do the same. Let's not forget again, remember my words about the political NATO, the political environment. We cannot just leave Afghanistan all alone after 2014. And we have at least to convince Pakistan that it is part of the solution and not part of the problem. Pakistan is the most important nation for stability in Afghanistan, but let me also mention the Russian Federation. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, let me also mention Iran. That nation can cause a lot of mischief in Afghanistan, which they have done in the recent past. A regional political arrangement, in other words, is of great importance. And I do realize before closing, I do realize, ladies and gentlemen, that it is extremely difficult to convince public opinion, certainly in Europe, but also to a large extent here in the United States, to explain to public opinion that this nation and what happens there matters to our security. We have great difficulty in the Netherlands to convince Parliament that they should stay committed, and the Dutch, I'm afraid, are not an exception here. Penultimate remark, Russia is a very complicated, difficult partner for NATO, but Russia is a partner. And Russia is a very important nation. Russia is important in the sphere of disarmament, conventional disarmament, nuclear disarmament. Russia is important to come to a form of agreement on missile defense. And the Russians make a lot of mischief about missile defense. Now, you don't have to be an Einstein to realize that President Obama's plans for missile defense are not directed against the Russians. There's no Einstein knowledge or intellect needed for that. But perception matters. And the perception in Moscow is that this is. We need the Russians for our logistical support in Afghanistan. We need the Russians to fight terrorism. We also should tell the Russians that they should honor their pledges to Georgia, that they should not make mischief in Moldova. In other words, make the NATO-Russia Council into the important body it is supposed to be. It's regrettable that the Russian president has apparently decided not to come to Chicago. As we speak today, there's a council in Brussels where Foreign Minister Lavrov is talking to his NATO partners. Let us not forget about the Russians. We might agree, we might fundamentally disagree, but Russia is important. Ladies and gentlemen, I come to a conclusion. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has been, over the decades, for many times, declared either dead or terminally ill by pundits, by journalists, and yes, even by politicians. NATO is alive and kicking. NATO is not going through an easy period, but NATO is alive and kicking. And Europe is not going through the easy period either, as I've tried to explain to you in the beginning of my address. But that does not mean that those two organizations matter a great deal, because they are based on the same values you have so close to your heart in this nation. Yes, there is a pivot to Asia, and Europe has to get used to the pivot to Asia, and that will change the mind and the position of Europe, definitely. President Obama has qualified himself as a Pacific president. None of his predecessors have ever done that, for understandable reasons. Your president is right in doing that. That has lots of consequences for Europe. But let's realize that we are in NATO together, bound by values like no other organization is bound by values. We should never forget that. And that's why I have faith in NATO's future before Chicago and many decades after Chicago, many decades to come. And my final sentence is this. In my 5.5 years being a NATO Secretary General, I have seen enormous loyalty from our men and women in uniform. And I cannot do anything else than by ending that I want to show my greatest respect for our men and women in uniform, for our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen and our Marines, because we can decide behind a desk in Brussels or in the Dutch or Belgian Parliament or in the US Congress that we're going to send tens of thousands of young men and women to Afghanistan or elsewhere, of whom many have paid the highest price over the past 10 years, because we thought it was politically right. We have it easy. They pay from time to time the highest price, and they deserve our greatest respect. And that was the most important lesson, apart from all the other lessons I've taken with me from 5.5 years at the NATO helm, I have taken home. And I think this is the nation, the United States of America, to stress it once again at the end of my speech. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Professor, thank you very much for your frank comments. We appreciate it. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for our question and answer portion. So if you could raise your arm and just wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a mic, that would be terrific. Any first question out there? Yeah, right over here in the corner, please.
Ambassador, to choose one of many honorifics that one could use. I would like to ask you a question about NATO and Turkey, and I would invite you to respond not perhaps only at the level of the highest political authority, but also perhaps if you could imagine yourself in the role of a captain or a lieutenant colonel in Mons. My question is, in the event, that hypothetical event, that Turkey were ever to choose in an unprecedented step to leave NATO, for whatever reason, political reasons, what can you, based on your intimate knowledge of NATO, tell us would be the costs to Turkey and to NATO of that kind of rupture?
The cost would be huge, huge. And I hope it will never happen. It was a big if your question started with. Thank you for the big if. Let me answer you along the following lines. I'm representing a dwindling minority in Europe who still very much favors Turkey's accession to the European Union. When Turkey is in a position to fulfill the conditions, of course. There are still too many journalists in jail. It's still not easy to build a Christian church in Turkey. But apart from all those things, that needs further reform. I'm a member of a dwindling minority. When I discuss populism, by the way, Turkey is also an easy subject for them. And I must admit that European nations, in the Turkish case, have moved the goalpost while the match was being played, because Turkey has been promised membership, and now two of the most important European allies and nations, the French and the Germans, the President and the Chancellor, have said, no. The maximum can be a preferred partnership. That is moving the goalposts. But I repeat, I'm representing a dwindling minority. I think there are such overwhelming geostrategic arguments to have Turkey not only in NATO but in the European Union. That is, in my reasoning and in my argumentation, more important than exactly answering the question, is Turkey a European nation or is it not a European nation? It's a secular state. It's a secular state. It's a Muslim state, but it's a secular state. And it's a model which is looked at in the Arab world, in the turmoil and the revolutions going on in the Arab world. But it is a secular state. I think the cost would be huge. Turkey is in the geographic position it is in. That is not Turkish choice, but Turkey is there. And if you look at the turmoil in the region, in the Middle East, and the role Turkey is trying to play there, first it was zero problems. Now that was not very successful. That's not the fault of the Turks, because the Arab world exploded. But if you look at Turkey, if you look at the position of Turkey, I only have to mention Syria, I only have to mention the run-up to the operation in Libya, or I have to mention Egypt, Central Asia, Afghanistan. It is an important nation. It is an influential nation. We may not like everything they do. I would hope, for instance, that the relationship between Turkey and Israel would be re-established. I think it's a great pity that those two have fallen so far apart. We know all what happened. I think the cost would be huge, and I would do everything in my power, if I had that power. I don't have it, I didn't have it, to prevent that from happening, because Turkey is essential for NATO. Turkey, by the way, has accepted part of the missile defense, as you know, scheme as proposed by President Obama. Turkey is essential. I'm not saying that Turkey is an easy ally, because I've had my fights with Turkey as well as NATO Secretary General. They have a highly qualified diplomatic corps. It is an essential nation.
Yeah, next question. Yeah, right here, please, in the third row. Could you wait for the mic? He's just coming. Thank you.
Earlier you talked about the Muslim-phobic part of Europe. How do you think this is going to affect Europe as we go forward and the Muslim countries become much more of a force in the world?
This is thank you for your question, sir. This is part of what I qualified as Europe looking for its identity. And I can tell you that's not easy. When I had this discussion I referred to with President Karzai, and he said we should continue our debate about universality, I thought, leaving his presidential palace, where does one draw the line? where does one say this is really going too far? I had a discussion with him about a boy who had been sentenced to death in Afghanistan for an offense which in your or in my legal system it would not be an offense at all. But then the President told me, Secretary General, these are our traditions, this is our culture. He didn't say this is our religion, by the way, but these are our traditions, this is our culture, this is our legal system. How far do you go in accepting it? And where do you draw the line? I drew the line, in that case, by telling the President that I could not face a widow of a NATO soldier having paid the highest price in Afghanistan if this was the nation for which he gave his life. If these were the values for which that soldier gave his life. And then we started a better discussion and a more in-depth discussion than just fighting about universality. Europe and Europe's identity has always been clear, but Europe is confronted and faced with much more than before. An example from my own upbringing in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, I was raised in what we then called in the Netherlands the Roman Catholic pillar. Zuil in Dutch, the ambassador will understand. The Catholics had it in their own pillar, and the Jews had it in their own pillar. Those pillars were crumbled while this process of secularization set in, as I refer to. My parents were liberal in that sense that at a certain stage they sent us, my brother and me, to a non-Catholic tennis club. There was outrage in the church, because that was not acceptable. But my parents thought, let those two brothers be in touch with other people as well, who have other beliefs. Now, Europe is facing a world where I would like to know much more about Islam and Taoism and Hinduism and Confucianism, because I have to. Because the world is so small. Could you have imagined NATO 15 years ago, 20 years ago, sending 150,000 soldiers into the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan? Could you have imagined NATO training the Iraqi armed forces, as we did after 2003? NATO had a bombing campaign for the Albanian Muslim majority in Kosovo in 1999. NATO went into Bosnia during the horrible civil war there in the 90s. There's a very close relationship between NATO and Islam. But the problem is, and I spoke about the disconnect between the elite and the rest, that I as a member of the elite, and you can understand, I mean we understand this discussion, but it is awfully difficult. It is awfully difficult to bring that across to a rather, and in many instances, critical electorate. And we have to find an answer for that disconnect, and I must humbly and honestly tell you that I haven't found it yet, and the body politics in Europe has not found it either, because if they had found it, the political fringes would not be as strong as they are in Europe.
Yeah, right here in the front row, please. Pat Koldyke. One sec, Pat, the mic's coming. Pat, one sec, the mic's coming.
What are your expectations and or hopes for this summit?
I've given you, Madam, a few elements in my speech. I would hope that I mean, ideally, but that's not going to take place. I would have liked to seen, as I said, the Russian president, and seeing a meeting with the Russians at the highest level. I hope that NATO can intensify its relationship with its partners. I think, well, from what I've read in public documents, but also in not so public documents, there's a discussion and debate going on whom should be invited. Anyway, the European Union and the European Commission. And I mean, that is all in confesso, as one says in Latin. But I would hope that the relevant partners, and I've given you a few examples, not an exhaustive list, will get an invitation. I hope that the NATO nations will learn and will make some initial moves how to behave and how to decide about your level of ambition in times of austerity. I was sitting next to Secretary Bob Gates when he made his valedictory address in Brussels. It was for the think tank Ambassador Hartog-Levin mentioned a moment ago. And that was, of course, a very gloomy picture Secretary Gates gave there in Brussels. But to a large extent, he was right. That's not to say that the United States of America is not cutting its defense budget. You are, but the problem is that there's this disbalance, the 75-25 I mentioned. And that should be redressed. And I would hope that allies might make a beginning by redressing that balance. And a number of other elements I've mentioned in my speech.
Yeah, Cecilia Moet, please.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your interesting comments. When you talk about values, and you also mentioned that your discussion with President Karzai didn't talk about the values of the Muslim faith, I'm curious as to whether or not you would see NATO moving more towards looking at the basic values of interfaith values that are common and using that as a platform to really mirror values that we have. Because I'm sure when you look at the Quran, the things that are legal are not necessarily moral.
True. I do agree. I must, though, and I entirely share your analysis, madam. We must not forget. I raised the elements of what NATO is, regional or more global. NATO is a political military alliance. NATO is not the European Union. NATO is not about projecting soft power. I have never been a great fan of a strong civilian arm for NATO. I'm rather French there, because the French share that opinion. I'm not French in every aspect, although my wife is a French teacher, but that should not be the final argument, of course. But NATO is a political military alliance. And my concern, madam, is that a division of labor, where NATO is capable of projecting hard power, and the European Union focuses only on projecting soft power, is not going to work. Because your president, the first Pacific president, has many more headaches. Not for nothing, President Obama is rotating your Marine Corps through Darwin in North Australia. There's a power balance in the making in that part of the world, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. There's a power balance in the making. And the Australian former Prime Minister Howard once told me when I visited him, you Europeans, you have no clue anymore what a power balance looks like and what is necessary to achieve a power balance. That's what your president is doing. He can't be in all places in the world at the same time, so the Europeans, and that includes also the European Union and the European allies within NATO, should be in a position that when the need arises, they can project hard power as well. The Balkans are not yet entirely stable. A lot of progress has been made, but the Western Balkans are not yet entirely stable. Bring stability in the Balkans. I mean, the Europeans cannot again, like in the Clinton years, ring the US doorbell and tell the Americans, sorry, Mr. President, we can't make it. Could you please come and help us out? That will not happen again. It will not happen again. So Europe should realize, and I hope, madam, coming back to your question, that will be a notion which will be projected by the European allies at the Chicago summit in a few weeks, that Europe will finally come to the conclusion, it has always been a strong French wish, by the way, in Europe to develop its separate military capability. That was always heavily criticized. France is now back into the military integrated structure of NATO, right decision of President Sarkozy of France. The European Union should get serious, not only about its foreign policy, but about its security policy as well. And it might surprise you to hear this from a former NATO Secretary General, but as I see the world in geopolitical terms, and as I think your President and your administration and the United States of America looks at the world in geopolitical terms, Europe will not be abandoned, far from it, the commitment is there, but Europe will have to take more responsibility than we have grown used to during decades, because we know that Uncle Sam would always come. Came to the beaches in the Second World War, but also came to Bosnia-Herzegovina and to the Western Balkans in the 90s. And was there again in Libya at the start of the military operation, because acting against Libyan air defense and air-to-air refueling is not something... those are the capabilities the European nations should build. They have no money. And that's why they should pool and share and coordinate.
Yeah, next question. Carl Bintnagel in the front row, please.
Thank you for your comments. You started your comments with a reference to the age of austerity in Europe and budget constraints. I wonder if there are policies which are possible, which are not yet really being seriously considered in Europe, which might mitigate some of the austerity, which is now part of the European policies. You mentioned the fiscal compact as a guarantee of the future of the European Union. Might there be other policies which might be possible, which are not yet being considered? Economic policies which might mitigate some of the austerity and assist in some ways the political unity of the European Union, and you mentioned some efficiencies which might be achieved by combining bases and defense resources. But might there be some economic policies which might also contribute to solidarity in Europe?
Flying out from Amsterdam, sir, to Chicago, to O'Hare, I read an interesting article by Bob Zalek in the Financial Times, exactly answering your question, the outgoing World Bank president, Bob Zalek, because the debate in Europe, and had I had more time, I could and perhaps should have added this, the debate in Europe, as it is now emerging, is between those led by Germany who say the gospel is austerity, and only by austerity you can come out of this crisis. No, others say, and Bob Zalek is one of them in his article, without growth, austerity will ruin your economies. This is a huge debate between economists in Europe. That's the first element. The second element is that I'm not entirely certain, look at Greece and look at other nations, I'm not entirely certain if certain European societies will be able to accept in staying quiet and not become enraged the austerity measures imposed on them. I mean, one of the back to populism again. The European Commission now has a very strong voice, Olli Rehn, the European Commissioner, in telling nations, listen guys, if your budget deficit is over 3%, I'll come and I'll hit you on the fingers and on the hand. That works to a certain extent. The Dutch in Brussels have always told everyone else, we Dutch like to tell everyone else how the world should look like, but we have done that in Brussels as well. And now the Dutch are facing a position where it's not certain if we can stick to the 3% budget deficit. And now the others say, let's wait and see what the Dutch will do. The debate is between economists, only austerity or also growth, and as Zalek adds, investment. Invest your economies out of the present crisis. For the moment, the position taken by Angela Merkel is the dominant one, because the fiscal compact is pretty clear on this and talks about austerity. But how and to what extent societies in Europe and the public in general and public opinion will accept this is a question mark. Christine Lagarde, the IMF director, because the IMF is going to meet, as you know, IMF and World Bank are going to meet coming weekend on an IMF firewall to protect, let's say, the crisis from spreading. We'll also have this as a dominant theme. If you want to have my personal opinion, but I'm not an economist, I'm to a certain extent on the Zalek line, that if you have only austerity and you don't combine it with investment and trying to take measures which also can launch some growth in the economy, you might be in trouble. That's my personal opinion. But I say again, I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer by profession and a politician. If being a politician is a profession, I think yes. But some of you might disagree.
Stephen Lake, right in the front row. Just 1 sec.
Thank you. This is almost a follow-up question to the one you just answered.
The White House is following eagerly and keenly the situation you were just describing and your colleague described before. Because I do not expect it, but for the sake of argument, but again, I do not expect it, I said it in my speech, a serious collapse in Europe will have grave consequences for the world economy. And given the fact that the United States is facing presidential elections in November, I could imagine that President Obama, seeing the economy in this nation picking up and seeing very bad unemployment figures becoming a bit better and seeing the first rays of sunshine in the economy, is not waiting for the moment that his European allies are going to cause shockwaves in the world economy. That's why I think, and I can say what I said on a European scale, I can enlarge the circle to a global scale. I do think, and that was to a certain extent what Christine Lagarde was referring at what she commented in the newspapers today and yesterday. I do think that political leaders, also the IMF and the World Bank, certainly the Americans for the reasons I just gave, but also the Chinese and others, realize that the world economy cannot bear a major collapse in Europe. And I say again, I cannot guarantee that in a year from now all 17 euro nations will still be 17 euro nations. I can tell you that everything will be done, and should be done in my opinion, to prevent the nations you mentioned, Italy, Spain, and potentially others, to be in a situation that they would become, like we said about banks, too big to fail. Because the Spanish economy and the Italian economy, as you and I know, are so much bigger than the Greek economy that it's a different ballgame then. Still, I think that the risk of a collapse is so enormous that no serious politician, be it a national politician, be it somebody who has responsibility in the international domain, will accept it. Look at what Draghi has done as president of the European Central Bank. That is not quantitative easing, but it is more or less the same under another name. I mean, literally flooding the banks with liquidity. I mean, a year ago, or 1.5 years ago, everybody would have said this is absolutely unacceptable. He's done it. We have to wait and see if it will have the success we all hope it will have. I think that such a collapse can be prevented, and I sincerely hope that you will not be able to prove me wrong in half a year.
Yeah, Richard Furfer, right here, please.
Thank you. One country that I don't believe was mentioned yet tonight, but seems to come up in every other conversation we have, is China. So I was wondering whether or not this is a topic that will be of great interest on the summit agenda, or you can give us our thoughts about the relationship between NATO and the emerging economy and so forth in China.
That relationship, sir, is developing. I do not have the latest in NATO, but until August 2009, when I left the stage and Rasmussen came, the level of the relationship was that the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs was welcome in Beijing, and the same level Chinese official was welcome in Brussels. Not yet the Deputy Secretary General, and certainly not yet the Secretary General. And the same applies to more or less to India. That was about the same. That was about the same level. In Pakistan, for obvious reasons, it was much higher because Pakistan is so relevant for Afghanistan. So there I met the President and the Prime Minister and the other important players. But that relationship is developing. I would think, I don't know, but that President Obama, remember what I told you about the Australian Prime Minister Howe, that President Obama, during the summit, would inform his NATO allies how he sees that power balance developing in that part of the world. How he sees this and what will be the consequences. Coming back to Europe, I think the 21st century will be a very important century for navies, for the naval forces, keeping open sea lanes, oil, gas, other commodities, I mean, of great importance. I hope, I come back to this 75-25%, that also European allies will realize that having what is called blue water navies, not only navies for coastal waters, but navies for blue water, for the oceans, will not only be in the United States inventory, but in the European inventories as well. You have 11 carrier groups, aircraft carrier groups. No one can match that. No mistake, ladies and gentlemen. I'm absolutely convinced and sure that the United States of America, for the foreseeable future will be by far, not only financially, economically, but also certainly military, the most important power of this earth. And thank heavens, a force for good. But, on the other hand, I think that even the United States of America needs allies from time to time. And this power balance to put it mildly, and this power balance in Asia and the freedom of the high seas are as relevant for the USA as it is for other nations. But I could imagine that President Obama would give his thoughts. There's also a G8 summit, after all, in Chicago here. So I mean, there's of course a relationship between the two.
Yeah, right there in the back row, please. The gentleman in the
Thank you for your presentation tonight. How do you see the role of NATO on the transatlantic alliance, and as it pertains to cybercrime, cyber threats, cyber warfare, etc., particularly as it goes for their members, partners, and other global actors, state and non-state?
NATO has done a lot. NATO has, as you might know, an emerging threats division, which is a new division, which deals with, among other things, cyber. NATO has brought a lot of expertise from capitals together. NATO, of course, let's not forget that. NATO is an alliance of 28 sovereign nations. NATO itself has no intelligence. For my intelligence in my NATO years, and Rasmussen is the same, for my intelligence, I was to a large extent dependent on what the United States, France and Germany and the UK would be ready to tell me. 28 sovereign nations. NATO should not, I think, as NATO, build a huge cyber capability, but NATO should pool knowledge and should pool resources to face this very important and dominant threat. What I know is that in all NATO defense ministries, hard work is being done on cyber, that budget cuts do not relate to what is cyber defense. And that cyber, as you indicate in your question, sir, is excluded in the budget cuts going on. NATO should coordinate. NATO should not inflate its own staff, certainly not in these days of austerity, by taking on things which can be done in an intelligent combination by the NATO nations. But cyber is of great importance. You and I know all the examples. I would say on the positive side, the Stuxnet worm, which was brought into the Iranian enrichment facility in Natanz on a tiny USB memory stick. But Estonia, the most northern of the three Baltic nations, was totally paralyzed a few years ago by, I have no proof, but certain computers who might have been in Russia, but again, I can't prove that. When Estonia and Russia had a big fight over a war monument, which the Estonians wanted to replace to another part of their capital, Tallinn. But cyber is so difficult because attribution is so difficult. You can spot a fighter plane, you can spot a tank on your border, or soldiers marching into your nation, but a cyber attack is not so easy to spot because, for heaven, you don't know where it comes from. Extremely important, NATO bringing expertise together and pooling resources, my answer would be.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned Libya and the lack of participation among some of the NATO countries. It seems this will only get worse as more and more countries can't afford to participate in NATO initiatives. You also mentioned that the current way of financing NATO initiatives isn't sustainable. I wondered if you could elaborate or explain some of the alternatives that may be in the conversation this spring or in the near future.
Well, that is I say again, extremely difficult balance NATO has to find between the now overriding principle, the costs lie where they fall. I gave you the example of the Apache attack helicopter, but you can find anything else you like. And the relatively small percentage which is done by common funding. Now, bigger nations are usually not that keen on common funding because they say, why should we pay twice? We have large inventories. First of all, of course, the United States of America, but also nations like France and Britain. We have our transport, heavy military transport aircraft. Why should we common fund transport aircraft in the NATO domain when we have them? We're not going to pay twice. Very complicated and very difficult. Still, I think this debate should be opened because I think the argument I made was rather convincing that nations will become reluctant to have a state-of-the-art armed force. I'm not talking about a superpower like the US now and not about France and the UK, but medium-sized nations like the Netherlands. If you hear a Dutchman speak, you always hear that the Netherlands are a medium-sized nation. We don't like to. We always want to be either the biggest of the small ones or the smallest of the big ones. You see, this is the problem we Dutch. So you heard me use medium-sized nation. That's what we like. But small nations, I'm not going to mention names now, are in a completely different position. So this is a very complicated debate. But I would hope, coming back to the summit agenda, I do not think it's on the agenda, by the way. But that's based on the experience in Afghanistan, which was, of course, a hugely costly operation, and still is, by the way, billions and billions and billions of dollars, that this might trigger allies to start their discussion. Briefly, another example, you know that NATO has the so-called NATO Response Force, the Quick Reaction Force, in which nations, on a rotational basis, provide forces. They commit a Marine battalion or fighter aircraft to the NATO Response Force. In the event the NRF is going to be used, it's a sort of what I've qualified as a reverse lottery. If you're in, you pay. If you're out, you say, thank heavens I'm out, because I don't have to pay. When NATO came to the assistance of Pakistan during the huge earthquake in Kashmir in 2005, NATO, by the way, interestingly acting as a humanitarian organization then, there was a lot of heavy equipment which had to be transported, airlifted at huge cost from Europe into Pakistan, into Kashmir. Pakistani administers Kashmir. Spain was so unlucky as to be in the NATO Response Force. And the Allies said, Madrid, costs lie where they fall. So Spain paid a huge amount of money. And I don't think I'm going too far when I say that that is a very restrictive element in using the NATO Response Force. You need a quick reaction force in NATO, but as long as you have it only or for the large majority of the funding on the cost lie where they fall principle, it will remain very difficult. In my time, I only succeeded in having a very tiny portion of the heavy airlift in the initial stages of an NRF deployment commonly funded. So I realize, and you're quite rightly to come back to this point, but I said, I think in my initial address already, I realize this is an awfully complicated matter. But the European Union has to discuss every so many years its budget as well, so why shouldn't NATO address these fundamental questions? It will take a few years, but one has to start sometime.
Yeah, last quick question there, please. The gentleman in the second row in the back.
Hartelijk dank voor uw aanwezigheid en
Geen
welkom
dank.
in Chicago.
Pleasure.
My question is related to Syria. Okay. With the carrier groups, at least the U.S. carrier groups, shifting to the Pacific, with the limited carrier groups available, the small carrier groups available in Europe, there is no Karel Doorman anymore. So how do you envision NATO responding if there would be a UN resolution to do something about the Syria issue?
Here is like one of the first questions, here is the if again. And as the Secretary General of NATO always said, I'm a journalist, I don't answer iffy questions, but I'll answer yours because it's a serious one. First of all, I do not see that resolution coming. The interests of many parties are too vital to bring that resolution to the Security Council. Look at the Russians having their naval base in Syria and their entry into the Mediterranean. Look at Syria being the ally of Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. You know all the arguments as well as I do. Syria is a totally different ballgame than Libya. And that's why I think that it will not come to a resolution and it will not come to military intervention. Because the second question, rhetorically, I would ask you and myself, is what, under present circumstances, could a military intervention achieve? It is developing into a rather sectarian conflict. In Syria, the Shia-Sunni divide in the Muslim world is fought out. There is a huge stake in Syria for Saudi Arabia. There's a huge stake for Iran. I mentioned Hezbollah and Hamas already. The stability in Lebanon, the relationship having Israel so close by. I don't think that in such a sectarian conflict, and I'm afraid that's a rather cynical comment, I don't think it is possible. I can't see any form of serious military intervention. What are those soldiers? And you need boots on the ground then. You can't do it like in Libya from the air. That's the easy, relatively easy part. You should do it on the ground. Even safe havens and corridors need forces on the ground and sufficient forces on the ground. And as a Dutchman, I only have to mention the word to another Dutchman, Srebrenica, and you and I know exactly what that means. If you create a safe haven, you then be serious about it. And I don't see that happening in Syria, because I see so many conflicts being fought out in Syria. I see Al-Qaeda coming stronger and stronger into Syria and into the resistance. I see Salafism entering into the Free Syrian Army. Again, I could have told you this is an if. I do not see the resolution, and quite honestly, I don't see any form of military intervention either, and I don't see any form of consensus in the NATO alliance for a military intervention in Syria. That consensus, as I told you with my reverse procedure in my intervention, that consensus was rather fragile. Libya already as well, and that was only from the air. But Europe has no carrier groups available. The French and the British, of course, are now working together to see, I think, French helicopters on a United Kingdom carrier. It's something, but I don't see the military intervention coming in Syria. Again, forgive me my cynicism, but I have never seen the international community shining brightly by consistency. That's not the way the world is composed.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the professor this evening. Thank you very much. Good evening.